Right. As the children head to Children's Church, well, I have one picture for you from this is from the youth activity last week hosted at the Harris's house. There's the kids that went there about to go on a scavenger hunt, and then Rex had a great devotional about anger, which I don't think was for the kids. I think he did it deliberately for me. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about it ever since then, Rex. It really did make an impression on me. He had a great illustration, and then we had dinner. But it was a good time, and we rushed back home because there was a threat of impending storm. So that's just this time of year. But if there's a sign-up sheet still on the back of the youth room door that goes down to the basement. If you would like to host a youth activity at your house, we still have some places where you can sign up, and we'll haul the youth out to you. And if you'll feed them, we'll ask you to do that. But if you need help with an activity or in a devotional and things like that, you don't have to do all that yourself. Just talk to me about it, and we'll work something out to help you out however we need to help. All right. When our last part 12 of our series that I entitled "Here I Am, Send Me," because as we're looking at there's other titles we could have given the series. This series that has consisted of Acts 13 and Acts 14. We could have simply called it Paul and Barnabas' First Missionary Journey. But that's boring. Everybody calls it that. And I wanted to personalize it as much as I could, not to myself and to you, to apply it to our lives as much as possible. And I hope that we've been able to successfully do that and stir within our own hearts. So here's the title of our last one, last 4 verses of the chapter. I've called it Time, Talent, Treasure, and Excuses. Time, talent, treasure, and excuses. Now I've heard I don't know how many times in prayer, I've heard over the years at the table when we are collecting the funds of the church, when people are giving their offering. I've heard in prayers over the years many, many times, Lord, we know we don't only give of our treasure, but we also give of our time. We also give of our talents or our abilities. But there's another type person in the church. We're not talking about people outside of the church. We're talking about people in the church who give neither time, talent, nor treasure, but continually give excuses. So our scripture reading this morning was Matthew 25, verses 14 through 29, the parable, what your Bible will often say, it be labeled as the parable of the talents. It's really an unfortunate title because too many people read the word talent and they automatically think of what our definition of the word talent is. It should be called the parable of the weights, because that's what a talent is. A talent in and of itself is nothing more than a measure of weight when we read that. Well, but it was a weight of something. It was a weight of money. It could also be called the parable of the money. But that's really not what the point of the parable is. So it's not about abilities, which is a better word for talent. And it's really not about money, even though that's what the word talent actually means in the parable. The word talent that is entrusted is just a representation of a person's entire life. That's what it means. So what did the master entrust his servants with when he left? Well, he gave them their life. Not only did he give them their life, he gave them their life and every single thing that is in their life. Every single thing that consists of your life. The master gave time in the parable. It said in the parable that he was going away on a journey. Well, that's the master in the parable is also Jesus. And any one of us, any person ever created, you can fill in the blank to the servants. Now we see who the true servants are and who the false servants are. But the master is Jesus, and the first thing that he gives is time. I'm going to go away for an undisclosed amount of time. When did Jesus go away? Well, it's been a little over 2,000 years now. When will he return? He doesn't say. All right? He doesn't tell us when he's going to return. We know he's going to return. So he gives us time. That time for us, that is our life. Whether you live a little while, people live different amounts of time, or whether you live a long time, either when you die or when Jesus returns, that's when you will see him again. Next, he gave them talent. Now, by talent, what I just used the word talent there. I wanted to use ability, but I wanted the 3 T's. I wanted to keep that. So anyway, but he gave them all abilities when he left. Now we all know that it's a very simple thing. You have abilities I don't have. I have abilities you don't have. We all have different abilities that are given to us from God. Notice this too, that no one in the parable has anything that hasn't been given to them beforehand. Whatever they have, it's just what God's given you. God gave you your life. That's all you have. What are you accountable for? Well, you're only accountable for what God has given you. God's not going to, if you're not a preacher and you've not been called to be a preacher, God is not going to look at you someday and say, well, why didn't you preach like Wes did? So he didn't call you to be a preacher. He gave you a different responsibility. It's about what he's given you and using that. But he gives everyone abilities. And lastly, he gives everyone treasure. And that's in the story, he gives, now a talent, depending on whether it was a silver talent, which was mostly what it was, or it could have been a gold talent, or it could have been a copper talent. But anyway, it's a weight of money. Now, the silver talent was the everyday wage of a worker. The amount of talents that were given, even to say, well, one guy had 10, one guy had 5, one guy was given 2, the other guy was given 1. And sometimes people want to feel sorry for the guy that was given the 1. Oh, I'm just one of those 1 talent people. The 1 talent was 20 years worth of wages. So no one is given a little. No one. Some people are just given more. But no one is given a little. So don't feel sorry for 1 talent guy, because he's entrusted with a lot. You add all those things together, and here's really what the Lord's point is. They're opportunities. When God gives you time, he's giving you an opportunity to use that time for his glory. Okay? When he gives you abilities, he gave you those abilities not so you could be a show-off or so that you could feel pride in yourself at what you're able to do. No, he gave you those abilities so that you would serve him to his glory. And when he gave you treasure, whatever things you possess in this life, wealth, on whatever measure it is, he expects you to use that, again, for his glory. He expects you to be a steward. Now, none of these things belong to these people, to the servants. They all belong to the master. They've all been entrusted to them. The first, he used his opportunities. He used his opportunities to his full. And when the master came back, he said, look, master, you entrusted me with a lot of opportunity and a lot of ability, and I used it, and look, it has increased. And he gives it back. The second used his opportunities. Now, the master didn't say to him, why didn't you do as much as the first guy? The master, all he expects us to use is what we've been given, okay? And he did. And the master gave him the exact same accommodation. Well done, good and faithful servant. But the third did nothing. Didn't use the time given him, didn't use his abilities to honor the master, and did not use the treasure that was entrusted to him. He hid it in the ground. He sat on it. Okay? And then when the master returned, he made excuses of why he didn't do anything. Church, this is a picture, not of, like I said, of irreligious people. This is a picture of religious people. This is a picture of people in the church. That should be a sobering warning to us. John 15 and verse 8, Jesus said, "My Father is glorified by this." How do we glorify God? That's the point of our life. How is he glorified? That you bear much fruit. That's what the parable's truly all about. Did you use what you were entrusted with in order to bear fruit for the Lord? And so, save yourselves. No. We're not saved by our service to the Lord. But look what our service is. And so prove to be my disciples. It's not our work for the Lord that saves us, but our work for the Lord is the only evidence that we can show in this life that we truly belong to him. A person that says they follow Jesus but give him none of their time, use none of their abilities to serve him, and give none of their treasure, but instead they say, well, you know, I don't have the time. Well, you know, God didn't give me any abilities. Really? Well, you know, I don't have enough money to give and to help with other things, or I would. If God gave me more, I would use it. You wouldn't. Let me just tell you, you wouldn't. If one of the truest things I ever learned in life, and I used to feel the same way, I used to think, well, someday when I have more, I'll give more. That's not true. I had to learn to give when I didn't really have much to give. Because a very wise man taught me one time, Wes, if you are not generous with what you have now, you will not be generous when you have more. So I put that so I tested that. It was true. It was very true. So here's what we want to do, though. We want to be the ones. We don't want this to be doom and gloom lesson. True, this is supposed to be an encouraging lesson. So this is what the people we want to be. We want to be the people who bear fruit, who use our opportunities, who glorify God with our lives, and are living proof that we are his disciples because of how we live our lives. Okay, now to our lesson. Where did we leave Paul? So here's where we left Paul. Now we started here in Antioch. And the church sent out Paul and Barnabas and John Mark on a missionary journey. Okay? So they went to Seleucia. They jumped on a ship. Here they sailed across to Cyprus. They began in Salamis, and it says they worked their way through the whole island. We don't know how many places they stopped and preached at along the way, but they preached all the way through the island of Cyprus, ending in Paphos, where they had their first, probably monumental success in their own estimation. There was the conversion of a Roman magistrate. So now the Gentiles are being reached, but not only Gentiles, but high-ranking Roman official Gentiles. Then they sailed across the sea here and landed in the Perga region. And this is where John Mark said, I'm out. I'm not doing the trip anymore. And we know this was a very big point of contention. Paul was not pleased at all with John Mark. Barnabas kind of let him off, but Barnabas and John Mark were related. So that might have something to do with that. They did not do any ministry here, but instead, and we'll talk about that again in just a second, they traveled up to Antioch. We call that Pisidian Antioch because it's in a different area. There were lots of Antiochs in the ancient world, at least 7 that I know of. They first ministered here, and they had success. There were lots of conversions. But then there was also persecution. So they left Antioch, and they went to Iconium. In Iconium, they had lots of conversions, but they also had persecution. So they left Iconium, and they went to Lystra. In Lystra, they had lots of conversions, but Paul's luck had run out. Paul was not able to escape the persecution here. They stoned Paul, presumably what they believed to be to death. And they drug him out the side of the city and threw him out to the garbage heap. And the disciples, the converts of the city, came out and gathered around him. And then Paul got up and he walked back into the city. So he goes back into Lystra, and then he spends the night, and then they travel to Derbe, where they have more success. And then after they have all these converts, they establish elders in each church, one in Derbe. Then they went back to Lystra. Then they went back to Iconium. They went back to Antioch, the places where the persecution is now thick. They went back because they had to establish these churches to set them up with the leadership structure that God had ordained for them to have in order to carry on in the future. They wanted these churches to last. They wanted these converts to be true converts, ones that would last forever. Later on, when Paul writes a letter, see this thing right in here, it says Galatia. When Paul writes the letter to the Galatians, that letter was a letter intended to go to all of these churches that were established. It didn't go to one church. It went to all of the churches in the area, the book of Galatians, the letter he wrote. Okay, so here's where we begin today. After the churches are established, they travel back down to Perga. They're going to go from Perga to Italia, and then they're going to get on a ship and sail all the way back and go back to Antioch. That's where we'll end today. And that will be the ending of Paul's first missionary journey. Oh, they always call it Paul's first missionary journey. I mean, Barnabas, that's kind of a slight to Barnabas because he was there the whole time as well. Paul did most of the preaching, though, so. First point for you, if you like to write in the points on your outline, is finish your race. We see that Paul finishes his race. He talks about it a lot. But what I want us to really take in is that we are to finish our race as well. We're not just to celebrate the accomplishments of Paul, but to learn from the accomplishments of Paul. For him to be a great model for us to model our own evangelistic efforts on. Verse 24 and 25 to begin. They passed through Pisidia and came into Pamphylia. Now, those aren't cities, those are regions. Okay, so they passed through those regions. When they had spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Italia. And the implication there is when they had spoken the word in Perga, then they went down and spoke the word in Italia. So it's not they just spoke one there and then didn't speak at the other. So, but isn't that an interesting thing? Because we know the first time they went through there, they didn't speak in Perga. And that would have made, it seems like that would have made most sense. Why pass up Perga? Well, there's some different theories according to that. So I've talked about this briefly, but let me explore this just a little bit deeper. I just want you to see this. Acts 13, verses 13 through 14. I've called this theory number 1. It says, now Paul and his companions put out to sea from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia. But John, this would be John Mark, left them and returned to Jerusalem. But going on from Perga, they arrived at Pisidian Antioch. So the first theory that I would throw out there was it conflict? What do I mean by that? Well, we find out later in Scripture that when John Mark left them, this was some form of a heated exchange. Paul was not pleased. Barnabas was trying to be peacemaker between the two. But John Mark abandoned the mission. That's what Paul's seeing from his point of view. You committed to being a part of this mission, and now you're leaving, and we just barely got started. Paul was upset about it. Now, when you are very upset about something, do you then want to preach to people or teach people about Jesus? Oftentimes, in the LaFleur household, and especially when Dad has done something dumb, and believe it or not, I do a dumb something every once in a while. or say something dumb, or lose my temper and say or do something dumb. Usually all three of those things work together at my house. Oftentimes, right after that, there will be, we'll sit down to dinner, and Kendall will say, I think someone else should probably say the prayer. Why? Because I've just been acting like a fool. You don't want to act like a fool and then say a prayer. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but the prayer I need to be praying is just one of a repentance, between me and God. I don't want to be praying for everybody at that point. I'm in no state to do it. So my first, just thinking back to my own dumb experiences, me being the dummy there, was it conflict that caused Paul to say, you know what, I got to have some time to think and to pray and to process what's just happened. I'm in no position to preach feeling the way I feel. Let's keep going, and we'll come back here later. They know they come back. They preach when they come back. So I think that's a possibility. I'm not trying to make you believe any of these either, okay? I'm just throwing them out as possibilities. Next possibility. Verse 14 again. But going on from Perga, they arrived at Pisidian Antioch, and on the Sabbath day, they went into the synagogue and sat down. So my second theory is this. Was it ignorance? What do I mean by ignorance? Well, here's how Paul had a very set method of doing things in the early days of his ministry. Here's what he would do. He would go to a town, he would find the synagogue, he would go into the synagogue, and he would teach there. And he did that over and over and over and over and over. And that was his pattern. Well, if you look at the history of the city of Perga, there's something very interesting about the archaeological finds of the city of Perga. The most interesting and striking thing in that area about Perga, in the excavation of that ancient city, is that there is no evidence of a synagogue. So, would Paul have looked around the city and said, hey, there's no synagogue here. I don't know where to start. How do we do ministry if we don't have a place to preach? So, that's just one other possibility. There is no synagogue in Perga. But what does Paul learn on his missionary journey? Well, Paul learns very quickly on his journey that he's having great success with the Gentiles and terrible success with the Jews. So Paul learns how to preach in places that are not synagogues in the midst of his journey. So then when he comes back to Perga, he's no longer intimidated that there's no synagogue there, and maybe that's why. Like I said, I'm not trying to get you to believe that, but it is a possibility. It's very interesting that in that whole area, in every single town, there is a synagogue except Perga. I'm not sure why there wasn't one there, but there wasn't. That was always a good starting point. Next. Last one I'll recommend, the one I talked about the first time. Galatians 4:13, Paul said, remember writing to the churches in Galatia, he said, you know that it was because of a bodily illness, that I preached the gospel to you the first time. It's possible that when Paul was in Perga, that he was too sick. Whatever the illness was, it's possible that he was too sick to preach when he was in Perga. Of course, you'd think if you were too sick to preach, you probably couldn't hike 120 miles north, but he still was able to do that. But there was an illness. He had some illness. We don't know what it was. But he says because of that, so the last one was maybe it was an illness. Whatever the reason was, it doesn't matter when it comes down to it, overall, why he didn't. The point is when they came back, now they're on a journey home at this point, okay? And let me ask you this. I'm sure that there's other people like this. It's not just people I know in my own family. But when you are on a trip home, Are you the type of person that likes to take your time and stop at lots of places on the way? Or are you the type of person that once you point your compass toward home, you just want to get home? Let's take a poll. Let's just do that for fun. Who likes to just ease home and see whatever you can see on the way? Okay. Who likes to get home as fast as possible? Well, see, y'all win. Okay, so I'll try not to be so hard on Kendall. Kendall's like, hey, this is what she says, when I'm ready to go home, I'm ready to go home, you know. And she says it just like that, too, all mean, like, you know. But I don't like that. I like to crawl home. You know, I like to go home nice and slow. Because once you get home, you're just back to regular life. And you get to do that all the time, right? Anyway, I'm trying to sell you on my point of view. So, let's ask these questions, though. Why did they stop in Perga this time? That's the main question I want to ask you right now. Why do they stop this time? Well, remember what our first point is. Finish your race. I think Paul saw the fact that they did not minister in Perga as unfinished business. I think it drove Paul crazy to go into a place where there were people that he could preach to, and he didn't preach to them. And Paul said, how can we go home? We skipped the town. Not only have we been there once, this will be the second time we've been there. And how can we pass through without preaching? I think Barnabas, the encourager he was, said, well, Paul, if you want to preach, let's go preach, you know, and encouraged him, and they went on and did it. So let's ask our question. Did God give them the time to preach? Yeah, they had time. They weren't in any pressing hurry to get home. So they had time to preach. Did they have talent? Did they have the ability to preach in that area? Well, they did. I mean, that's what they were. Too much of the emphasis goes to Paul, but Barnabas is a preacher and teacher too. Now, he very humbly, you know, let Paul kind of take the lead role here. But Barnabas is also a preacher. You know, if we go back to Acts and look when they were first sent on this trip, Barnabas starts off as the leader of the trip, and he is the main speaker. Very quickly, somewhere along the line, Paul's gifting from God becomes very apparent, and Barnabas says, hey, you've got something that I don't have. You're going to be the main preacher from now on, and Paul becomes the main speaker. But do they have ability? Yeah, they have ability. So they've got time, they have ability. Did they have treasure? I mean, were they physically? Did God put them in a place where they're physically able to do this? I mean, financially so. Well, they had to be because they did. I think they were not destitute. You know, I don't know. I mean, they're not making money along the way, so they either took some with them or the churches are helping them. People are helping them. But God has gifted them with enough resources to be able to do what He's called them to do. They have all those things. Did they have excuses? And I don't say that in a negative way. I'm saying like they probably had some good excuses. Like, you know what? We've done a whole lot on this trip. Here's Paul. Paul was like, should we stop in Perga and preach there? Well, let's think about it. Let's talk about it. I'm just ready to get home. Let's just go home. After all, I mean, and Paul could have made the argument better than anyone. Have we done enough on this first trip? Is there ever going to be a second trip? We don't know. Is this the only trip? Or we don't know there's going to be a second missionary trip coming up. Do we want to do more, or have we done enough? I mean, I think that's the big question. Have we done enough? And as they're asking that question, you know, Barnabas is looking at Paul, and his body's still all mangled from when he was stoned, and they thought that he was dead. Yeah, I think I've done enough. And everyone would say, yeah, you've done enough, Paul. Don't feel like you need to do any more. Look at what you've already done. You've already been, I mean, who in this room has been stoned like that? No one. But did they make it? They made no excuses. Nope, we have the time, we have the ability, we have the resources. Let's do it. Why would we not do it? There are people here who don't know Christ. I love that. They have opportunity. They seize their opportunity. They're like the 5-talent guy. They're like the 2-talent guy. They seize the opportunity. They're not like the excuse maker. Next point. Celebrate his and your victory. Now, I anticipated someone maybe taking offense at me adding the and your into this point. Like, wait a minute, like all the victory is God's. All the glory goes to God. That is true. That is true. I'm not knocking those things. But your victory is his victory. His victory is your victory. Let me show you with Scripture instead of trying to convince you with my words. Going back to the parable, verses 20 and 21, the one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought the 5 more talents, saying, Master, you entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I have gained 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. Well done. Now that's our goal. That should be our pointing goal in life, is to hear those words from the master someday. Well done. Your version may say servant instead of slave, but the word is doulos, which means nothing but slave in the ancient world. Okay? Slave is the best translation. Servant is also fine, but you just know that servant is a slave. All right? Well done, good and faithful slave. That's what we want to hear. Is that a victory for us to hear those words? You bet it is. Was it a victory for the master to return and to be shown what was done with the life of the servant? Yes, absolutely it was. It's a victory for both. It's a victory for the master. It's a victory for the servant. Our victory is shared. That's a wonderful thing. Verses 26 and 27. From there, they sailed, so they preached in Perga, they preached in Attalia. We're not giving much details about that, except for this. From there, they sailed to Antioch, back to where they came from. They've gone back to the mainland now, from which they had been commended to the grace of God for the work they had accomplished. So they get back and they're commended. They're celebrated. They come back and they put together their PowerPoint and they show all their pictures and they tell everyone about everything that happened on the trip. Hopefully we'll be doing that in a few weeks. Me and Rex and Tyler will get to do the same thing from a trip that we get to make. We'll come back and we'll show pictures and give a presentation and show, and people always, congratulate the trip when we come back from things like that. Verse 27. Here's why it's not wrong that they're commended, because the glory is not given to them. Now they share in a little bit of the Lord's glory on this, but it's just the glory that shines from the Lord to them. It's not their glory. And look what it says in verse 27. When they had arrived and gathered the church together, they began to report all the things that God had done with them. Hear that? Let me say that one more time. They began to report all the things that God had done. Not that they had done. It's all in the way you present, what God has done. If you come back, you can ruin the whole thing. You can come back and say, I did this and I did that. And man, they thought they killed me, they stoned me, but I got up. I'm strong, You can mess it up. You can take all the glory away from God and project all that glory onto yourself. But no, they come back and they go, you wouldn't believe what God did in that area. You wouldn't believe what he did in those cities. So they came back to report all things that God had done with them. God does use us. He uses us for his glory. So it's not wrong to be proud of that. It's wrong to take God's glory or to swell up with pride over the deal. But it's not wrong to serve God and be glad that you're serving God. takes all the joy out of missions if you do that as well. Here's another thing. I've worked with missionaries before that somehow had it in their head that if you were joyful and like happy while you were on a mission trip, you were doing something wrong. You had to be miserable the whole time. Let me tell you, the misery that we encounter on our trips is just because of natural circumstances. All the rest of it is joy and it is to me. I don't speak for everyone else. But all the rest of it is joy, and it is fun. And I use that word fun. My definition of fun probably isn't yours, because I've taken people before who have said to me, Wes, you said this was fun. I'm like, I am. This is the most fun I've ever had. They go, you're crazy. You are out of your mind. I'm never going anywhere with you again. And some say, you're crazy, but I see what you mean. It just depends. So God did this with them, and how God opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. Not Paul and Barnabas. They didn't open the door of faith. I can't give you faith. Paul could give no one faith. Barnabas could give no one faith. God opened that door of faith. And then God had his servants. He entrusted them with the things that he had given them. He said, here's what I want you to do. I'm going to come back someday. While I'm gone, I'm entrusting you. I'm giving you responsibility. I want to see what you do with it. That's every single person in this room. God has given us all opportunity and responsibility, and he wants to see what you're going to do with it. Let me take it just a little different angle just for a second. In 1 John chapter 2, verse 28, John wrote this. Now, little children, abide in him. Abide in Jesus. Okay? So that, why am I abiding in Jesus? So that when he appears, we may have confidence. Okay, so there's the first premise. So he said there's two types of people when the Lord returns. That's probably a false dichotomy. It's probably some other types in there as well. But let's just use what John illustrates here. The first person, he says, abide in Christ so that when Christ appears, we can have confidence. Now, if Christ showed up right now, what feeling would you feel? Well, we don't know exactly. But imagine it. I try to imagine things like that. If Christ appeared right now, what feeling would I feel? He says some people, when Christ returns, is going to feel confident. Why are they going to feel confident? Master, you entrusted me with 5 talents. See, here's 5 more. It's a reason for confidence. You gave me opportunity, Lord, and you gave me stewardship, and I used what you gave me. I failed a lot along the way. I did the best I could with what you gave me. Well done, good and faithful servant. Here's the other person. Here's the juxtaposition here. So that we have confidence and not shrink away from him in shame at his coming. So there's another category of person. A person who, when the Lord returns, says, uh-oh. Let me give you a for instance from my own life. My mom used to do a terrible thing when me and my sister were kids. I say it's a terrible thing. You've probably done the same thing. Or your parents probably did the same thing to you at some point. I thought it was terrible at the time. But my mom would leave. And she would tell me and my sister, I want the laundry folded. I want the lawn mowed. I want the trash taken out. I want the carpet vacuumed. How long are you going to be gone, Mom? I'm not telling. Now, that's the mean thing in me and my sister's estimation. How long is she going to be gone? So we'd figure out how much time it took to do those things. Okay. So we know how long it takes to do the job. We don't know how long Mom is going to be gone. So what do kids do? How long can we play before we need to do, or how long can we watch TV or play Nintendo or whatever we did? How long can we do what we want to do before we do what Mom said to do? It's a gamble. It's a big gamble because Sometimes we would do the right thing, very seldom, and do the stuff we were supposed to do first. Maybe we did that once in our lifetime, okay? So we didn't do that very often. We were both terrible examples to each other, and if one of us was strong, all it took was the other one saying, do it later. Okay. So sometimes we do it all, and Mom would come home later, and we'd be doing whatever, and she'd see everything was done, and she'd be so proud, so excited that we did all those things. We got it all done, and then we were doing what we wanted. What happened most of the time? Most of the time, she came home, and we either just got started, or we hadn't even got started yet. Now, sometimes when she came home, we stood at the door, just beaming, heads held high, chest thrown out, excited. Yes, we're going to be rewarded somehow because we got everything done. We did what we were supposed to do. Other times, we shrank away in shame and knew that we had a beating coming usually. But I'm not advocating that. But that's what we got. So, I'm not trying to equate those things exactly because here the commentators, and I'm not trying to make a case for either one. Of course, you're going to see what side I kind of land on more. But the commentators will say, well, those that don't have confidence and shrink away in shame, those aren't Christians. That's a possibility. It is also a possibility that they are Christians, because Paul talks about two different types of people in the New Testament. He talks about people that are Christians, but they're barely Christians. In other words, they barely make it. They're barely saved. But then there's another type of person who thinks that they are a Christian, but they're not. They're self-delusion themselves into believing that they are. Here's the trouble. We don't know the difference between those two because they look just alike. These are basically, so you're either a Christian, a true follower of Christ, who doesn't really do much of anything, or you think you're a true follower of Christ, but you're not. Either way, church, and I don't care which one is which, my goal is not to get away with as much as I can get away with in this life and still be called a Christian. My goal as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, is not to do what's the least amount I can do and still be saved. If you're asking those questions, you are in a bad, bad state of affairs. Let me tell you, and you should be worried for your own soul. Okay? Our thought process should be, what can I do with the opportunity that God's given me? How much can I do before He returns? How much can I do? It's not the doing of the stuff that saves us. We know that. But we want to hear those words when Christ returns. Well done, good and faithful servant. We want to have confidence. We want to look forward to Him coming home before we're ready for Him to come home, because we've done what He's given us opportunity to do. Let me show you why I believe that John, in this particular case, is talking to Christians, okay? Because the people he's talking to, he refers to as little children. Now, that's the way John speaks to Christians. That's the way he talks to new Christians. I think he's talking to new Christians that some are following and doing what they're supposed to do, and some, even though they're true followers, they're not doing what they're supposed to do. Here's the case I make. Romans 8:1. Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. One of my favorite verses. Just love that because it makes me know that if I'm in Christ, there's no condemnation for me. At Christ's return, there is only reward. There is only reward or not. Because Paul also says, here's the barely Christian argument, okay? 1 Corinthians 3:12 through 15. And we've recently studied this, so you can go back and check out those lessons. But now if a man builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will become evident, for the day will show it, because it is to be revealed with fire. And the fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. It's very similar to the parable of the talents. If any man's work which he has built on it remains, he will receive a reward. That's what you do in your life, okay? If anything you did in your life remains, once it has been tested by God, you will receive reward for that. I don't know what that is. I don't know how that works. At a minimum, it's well done, good and faithful servant. See, what do you mean say like at a minimum? And I don't mean to minimalize that. Let me tell you how powerful those words will be when you get to hear those words someday. I know this is going to make me weepy. I think I probably told the story before here too, so you'll know what it is before I get there. When I was in college and I was dating Kendall, one time it was either Thanksgiving or Christmas. I was spending with her family. And Kendall's dad said in front of the whole family, I think I just graduated and I was about to go to graduate school. And Tim said in front of the whole family, Tim being her dad, he said, Wes, I just want you to know how proud I am of you. Of course, normal parents tell their kids they're proud of them often. And their kids, it's not a shock to their system to hear those words. I mean, I didn't have normal parents. So, Tim says that to me. And everyone looks at me. And I burst into tears. It's not a small thing to receive accommodation from someone that you love. It's not a small thing to receive an accommodation like, well done, good and faithful servant from the Lord. There are no words that you will ever, whether you realize it or not, there are no words that you will ever desire hearing more in your life than those words. Let me continue with the verse here. If any man's work which he's built on it remains, he will receive a reward. Verse 15. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss. Loss of what? Not a loss of his soul, not loss of heaven. Loss of reward. Whatever that is from God, he will suffer loss. And then, as if Paul knows that we're going to be confused by that, he adds, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. So here's the big difference between what Paul's talking about here and the parable of the talents. The one talent person is cast into hell at the end of the parable. That's a person who's not a true follower. Okay? This is a person who is a true follower, but doesn't have anything to show for it. Like I said, the trouble is, for us, we can't tell the difference between those two because they look basically the same. But that's my argument for believing that John is speaking to Christians. He's trying to encourage the Christians to, when the Lord returns, live your life in such a way that when he returns, you have confidence and that you don't have any part of you that wants to shrink away in shame when he returns. The questions I ask myself: did I use the time that God gave me? I mean, my time's not up yet. I mean, so I'm still using it. But these are the things I've asked myself as I studied this lesson. Did I use the talent? Do I use the abilities that God has given me? Did I use the resources, the wealth that God has given me in life, whether that be a little or a lot? Did I use it? Because one of the greatest things about old Israel and the old law is that no matter how much money you have, everyone gave the exact same percentage by the law. Everyone was commanded to give, and I'm not trying to push a political agenda, though it probably could be a good one. There was a flat tax, basically, in Israel. And you say, well, the rich give so much more than the poor do. No, they don't. They give the exact same. Everyone gives the same that way. And I use that, I'm just saying that to say this. This is what the Lord expects of you. He expects you to use what he gave you. He doesn't expect, God is never going to ask you to use an ability that you don't have. He's never going to ask you to, give money that he hasn't given you. That's impossible. Or do I make excuses? Here's what I think those who, at the Lord's return, those who shrink away in shame, I think there are people that say things like this. I thought I had more time. Have you ever heard someone say that? I've just happened to be with many people on their deathbed, which sounds like a terrible thing, but it's actually it's a very illuminating thing. And I remember Kendall's Uncle Bill died not too many years ago. He had an uncle named Bill. He died at a pretty young age of cancer that came on him all of a sudden and just took him out. But I remember he was wanting to take his sons to the Grand Canyon. And we were at his house doing a work project to do some stuff. And his son said something to him about it. And he said, oh, son, he said, boys, we got plenty of time left for that. He didn't. He didn't have plenty of time left for that. But on a much more serious note than in going to visit the Grand Canyon, what have you said? Someday I'll do this for the Lord. You know what? Someday doesn't come. If you have time to do it now, do it now. Do it now. And ask yourself the question, too, if I'm saying that I don't have time, do I truly not have time? Or am I lying to myself? I used to have a teacher who said to me all the time, I used to tell him I didn't have time. He said, Wes, you have time for everything you want to have time for. It was true. It was true. I think people will also say, well, I intended to do more. It's kind of the same as the first. I planned to do more. Why didn't you do it? I didn't get around to it. I'm too busy with other stuff. I didn't get to it. I intended to do more. If I knew I would see Jesus soon, what would I do, or what wouldn't I do? This is the last question I was asking myself. If I knew that Jesus was going to come this afternoon, what would I do? I don't know. I probably wouldn't stop in preaching time. I would probably just preach the rest. I just want to be preaching when he returns, I want to be doing something good. Don't give me an opportunity to be doing something stupid. I hope that I'm either like on a mission trip, like suffering when the Lord returns, or that I'm literally teaching in a classroom or the pulpit. Just doing something productive. Just doing something for the kingdom, right? Instead of, whatever else. But what would you do if you knew he was going to return soon? And what wouldn't you do? Well, I think I could make a very strong effort of not sinning. If I knew he was coming back this afternoon, I would do my very hardest to not sin between now and then. Why? Just because I want to. But here's the thing: we don't know when the Master's going to return. So do what you have opportunity to do now, and don't sin thinking that, well, God's grace is going to cover it anyway. But that's not the way to live life. It's not the way God intended for you to live your life. I'll close with this. Matthew 24, verses 42 through 46. Jesus talking about that last day. Jesus said this, therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you also must be ready. For the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds doing so when he returns. Some of us want to be living for Jesus when he returns. That's it. Last point. Dream it, plan it, do it. I used to get a magazine. It was like a sub magazine of National Geographic. It was called National Geographic Adventure magazine, and it was all about hikes and adventures you could take all over the world. And the motto of the magazine was "Dream it, plan it, do it." I love that because you can apply it to so many other things. But most people I've talked to that I've said, "Hey, let's do this," you know. And I'm usually talking about an adventure of some kind. And they go, "Oh, well, I've always wanted to do that, but I've never done it." Well, if you don't dream it, you're not going to do it. If you don't put a plan in place to accomplish it, you're not going to do it. And then finally, you just have to do it. So it's a good way to get things done. Dream it. Make a plan. And then do it. Last verse. And they spent a long time with the disciples. Well, we know from the history of Paul's life, because we have more of the Bible, that when they returned to Antioch, they stayed with the church there a year, around a year, give or take a little, before they went off again. It's good. It's good to be home. It's good to be home and get home to recharge your batteries for the Lord, and to learn more, to plan more, so you can go out and do more. Philippians 1:21 through 24, Paul said this. Paul's in prison in Rome when he writes this letter to the church in Philippi. And he says to them, "For to me to live is Christ." If I'm alive, I'm living for Christ. But if I die, don't cry at my funeral. To die is gain. Don't say, "Oh, we want him back." I don't want to come back. Once I'm gone, I want to be gone and stay gone, because I'm going to be with Christ. But if I am to live on in the flesh, that's all of us here right now, right? If I am to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me. No matter what place God puts me in, I'm going to do his work. And Paul even says in the same letter, you wouldn't believe what's going on at the church, in the prison here in Rome. I've already converted. I mean, the Lord has already used me to convert half of the people in this place. We're talking about Roman soldiers that are guarding him. The word is spreading, even in the midst of my persecution. Paul didn't even see prison as an impediment to doing God's work and preaching the gospel and sharing Jesus with people. I hope you've been encouraged by this series. I hope that somewhere in your heart and in your mind, when you hear those words of Isaiah, "Who will go for us?" that you will say, "Here am I, Lord, send me." When opportunities are presented, that you jump on those. They can be opportunities of any kind. This church, we're a small church, we have lots of opportunities. Don't see those as, I don't know how you view them. I don't know how you view the opportunities here. But try to think of them in a different way. Try to think of them in the way the Apostle Paul would think of them, the way he would see them. If you don't belong to Christ today, give your life to Christ. If there's anyone we can serve, come forward as we stand and as we sing.